Hello and welcome to this presentation on literary translation, working with a translator. My name is Heike Westendorf. I have been translating for almost 20 years. I'm also a writer who lives in Germany. I translate mostly into German, and currently I'm translating a fantasy series for Benjamin K. Hewitt, who is joining me on this presentation today. Hello, Ben.
Hello, Heike. So glad to be here today. I think I've been really excited about doing this panel, so thanks for asking me to help.
Well, this is wonderful because we've actually done this before, right? Collaborated on a translation, or we're doing it right now. So this is perfect, to have the other side, so to speak, on this as well.
It's so cool to be able to tell people, yeah, I have a award-winning story in Germany. I won the 2019 Marburg Award for my story, Sonnenbrand.
That is very cool. That is very cool for me too, for the translator. It's kind of nice.
Yeah. One of the things that made me really excited about doing translations and working with you was early on when I was selling books in the US and selling books in the UK. And then weirdly, I was selling at least 10% of my sales were in Germany. And
this is English-speaking books, you mean?
This is English-speaking books. And I was like, what's that about? And so that's when I was like, well, maybe if they like the English version, maybe they'd like a German version too. Why is that? What do German people like translations or used to reading translations or?
Yes. So essentially, yes. And it differs in every market, right? Or in every language. But the German market is very, very accustomed to reading translations. So mostly English speaking. So a lot from the UK, a lot from the US. But we also get a lot of Scandinavian literature, for example, Icelandic, Swedish, Norwegian, Danish, all of that. So that's a big part of it, I think. And English is one of the languages that is taught in school, starting usually from 5th grade, sometimes elementary school. So, people go out and look for books that they can read. And if if they're competent in English, they'll go out looking for English books. It started kind of with the whole Harry Potter craze, I think. It probably started before that, but people didn't want to wait for the translation to come out. And it used to take a long time for translation to come out. So the original would come out, and then 6 months or 12 months later, sometimes the translation would come out. So as soon as the internet started up, people would.
For my translations?
No, I'm not going to take that long for your translations. But people didn't want to wait for the next installment to come out in their language. So, if they felt competent or even, armed with a dictionary, they just went and bought the book and, tried to puzzle out the meaning of this, which is interesting. For some of the Harry Potter translations, there's actually been community translations online. So, they would split up the chapters and everybody would translate a chapter so that it would get there faster.
Wow. Okay. So, right there is an argument for, hiring a translator and getting to work on your own, because I can imagine some of the mistakes that are made in those communities. Good for them, right? That's
yes.
That is awesome, right?
Yes.
I don't think I don't have a lot of friends who would have the guts to try something as audacious as, oh yeah, we're going to split up chapters and translate something into English because we just can't get it fast enough,
And the goal is not to produce the perfect literary translation, right? It's you want to find out what happened to Harry. You want to find out what happened to Ron and Hermione. So that's that's the intention behind it, to find out what happens to the story. And that's kind of the cool thing about it, right? You care for the characters and you just kind of follow them.
That's something really interesting to think about in terms of translation, right? If it's a good book, if it's carrying, right? The fact that people don't need a literary translation to really get into your stories as an author is actually kind of exciting, because it takes the pressure off of you as an author to pick the perfect translator. now, obviously, I want you to do a great job, right? I want you to, make it come alive in German. But at the same time, if people like the story, if they're translating Harry Potter for themselves, if they want to move forward, that almost takes some pressure off the situation.
It's hard to screw up a good book, I think, as a translator.
Yeah. And that actually reminds me, like, when I bid out the French translations for the Paladin's Thief, I had 5. I think I down selected from 19, so I had 19 applicants. Right. I asked them for a first, and you have to compensate, right, when you do this. But I asked them for a paragraph of translation, and then I down selected to, actually I down selected to 5, and then I asked for a paragraph, and you have to compensate in that case. And then I had, out of those 5, I had 3 workable translations. I had one that I really liked that felt true to me as an author. And again, I could have done German, I could have done Japanese, because both of those markets actually buy my books. I chose French because I'd never done this before, and I could I'd never do the translation myself, going French to English. But reading the French translation and knowing what it was in English, I felt confident I could get a good quality out of that. But it was fascinating to see how each of those 3 translations would have actually worked. They would have all have worked and brought the story to life.
But they were different, right, is what you're saying. And that's one of the things. So just like, you give any story to 3 different writers and you get 3 different stories, you give the same text to 3 different translators and you get 3 different texts, right? Because translators have their own style and translators have their own interpretation of the text as well. Yeah. I mean, they're not going to differ wildly, right? It's going to say the same thing, but, I may choose this word and somebody else may choose another word. So there's always a difference.
It's almost like, I live in Houston, so driving from Houston to Dallas, there are like 3 or 4 different ways to get there. If you value visual beauty, you don't go down I-45, you take the side roads and you take the back roads. If you want to get there fast, you go down the freeway. If you want to go to the cool restaurants, maybe you're part freeway, part part restaurants, part access roads. So the translations is kind of the same thing. What to you, what is it that you want, right? And we could ask the question, what makes a good translation? But I think that's a fraught question. That's a complicated question because everybody values something different.
And it depends, right? It always depends. Like you said, you can take different roads from Houston to Dallas, and they're all the right roads, right? There's no wrong way to get to Dallas as long as you end up there. So, and it's the same translation, yes. Just like you said, as a translator, you have to make decisions and you have to consider, what does the author want? You can ask him, if you can get in touch with the author, that would be ideal, of course, but you have to make assumptions and you have to make decisions. And that produces your text in the end.
That's actually what I've enjoyed working with you, like being able to just, exchange email or to, get on WhatsApp or something and have a conversation. You've asked me some funny, interesting questions. Working with my first translator, the whole IT world wasn't quite as convenient, and so we had to do a lot via email and track changes. But something you said kind of made me smile. I was thinking suddenly, maybe if a work is really successful, it's almost like you could do this fun and totally unpredictable experiment where you do a translation for the executive and you do a translation for the literary reader and you do a obviously it's going to cost way too much to do, but it'd be kind of fun to the businessman translation of Darts is going to look very, I laugh about this because if you read Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson, it is a business manual. Like like, Kelsier gets up and they're sitting around the boardroom and he has a whiteboard, and there are tons of fun organizational principles in that. And so I wonder how that, how did Miss Bourne feel in to different people in different languages?
Right. And that's one of the things that's always going to feel a little different, right? Sometimes it's easier in fantasy because the world is different anyway. So, say you have a story set in, I don't know, Houston, for example, right? There are certain things there that make it a Houston story. But if it's in a fantasy world, or, set in Munich or Berlin or Paris or London or whatever, that is inherently integrated into that culture or into that country. But if you have something that's in a different world altogether, sometimes that's easier to translate, right? Because the concepts are new to everybody. They're new in English because the author made them up. So, they're new concepts too in German or in French or in Japanese or whatever language you're translating into.
How do you, I'm familiar with translation. So when I introduce myself, people often ask, well, what do you do for work? And so my introduction is I work for NASA and I translate English into English. And usually people kind of like, they look at me and then they smile and laugh because engineers do not talk like, non-engineers or procurement specialists or business people. And that's another way, I lived in France for a couple of years. I have a degree in French, but when I went to France for work, it was exactly like stepping into NASA for the first time, where I didn't understand anything that was being said, because there's acronyms on acronyms on acronyms. And like I sat through hours and hours of meetings for the first few months of being a NASA employee, feeling like I was like back in France. And then I actually did go to France. And now I've got to learn all of the special terms, like the aeronautical terms, that like, it's a whole different language that I never learned when I lived there. And so like a big question for me is, I speak French, I speak English, I understand German, I know a little bit of Arabic, and a little bit of Spanish. Like, and I know you have like 4 or 5 languages that you can operate in. How do you ensure when you're doing, and this is kind of getting to the meat of the whole literary translation, what are some guiding principles when you're trying to come up with a translation, a literary translation? What are some things that you think about?
So one of the things, one of the theories in translation is, two schools of translation, essentially. You bring the reader to the story or you bring the story to the reader, right? Okay. And what I mean by that is take a hot dog, right? Okay. Somebody buys a hot dog in New York at one of those hot dog stands, right? Relish on it, mustard on it, all that stuff. So I translate it into German, right? We don't have hot dogs like that. Right? If I say hot dog, people don't know, the hot dog in a bun with the relish and the mustard on it. That's not the image that the person has usually, right? So you consider, like, do I translate it as hot dog, and people are like, oh, this is a snack that they sell in New York, and maybe they go look it up on the internet, right? Mm-hmm. Or and that is bring the reader to the story. Bring the story to the reader is, I'm going to explain it's a sausage in a bun, right? Which is something that we have in Germany, right? Mm-hmm. So if I wrote in there, if I translate hot dog as sausage in a bun, a German person is going to instantly have an image in their brain about what this snack is. And that's a decision I make as a translator, right? And I make it based on the intention of the author and who my audience is. Okay. So is this just a snack that somebody picks up? And it could just as well be a slice of pizza, right? It's just a snack. It doesn't have any meaning in the story. Right. And then I can translate it as whatever. But if it has to be this hot dog, and if it has to have mustard, and it has to have relish for whatever reason for the story, then I'm going to have to do that. And the other thing...
You're going to bring the kid to New York and have him experience and understand and learn about... Right. Whereas you could almost take New York and turn it into Hamburg. That's probably a joke, right, for our English listeners, right? But and then talk about it in terms of the German context.
Yes. And so it's a way to expand somebody's horizon, right? Like, do you put them in the story in New York and have them taste the food that is offered there, for example? And this would work with Japanese food as well, right? Like any of those things. The other thing is to consider is who's your audience, right? So how experienced is my reader? How well traveled is my reader? Is this the culture that I'm translating from? Is that something that they'll know? So the average German adult will have a concept of New York and will have a concept of a hot dog. But if I have, say, a children's book and a children's audience who is not experienced at all with reading or traveling or other concepts, it may be a bit different. It may pull them out of the story. It may confuse them. It may not help them. And those are essentially decisions that it comes down to for the translator, right? Like, what does the author intend with this? Where is the story set? Is it important where it is set? And also, how experienced is my audience with it?
So those are, you have a philosophy. Do you bring the reader to the story, or the story to the reader's context? Mm-hmm. And then answering that philosophical translation question, you're going to think about, what is the intent of the author? So you're going to try and understand what the author's trying to convey. Another guiding philosophy or guiding principle would be, you want to understand who the intended audience is so you can deliver to them what they need. Those are essentially considerations that authors need to be thinking about too. Who am I actually writing this story for? Mm-hmm. And if you do a good job as an author, that should actually facilitate the translation, maybe?
Yes,
it's obvious.
It would. Of course, there's reasons, that the author may have. Some of them may just be, and maybe the author didn't think about this, right? This is just a snack. And if I know that's the case, then I will translate it as just the snack and make the decision, right? So I can make a decision too. It's not just the author. But one of the points I wanted to make, when I was just saying children's literature, right? Everybody knows the Harry Potter books. We mentioned them before, but there was a U.S. American translation. J.K. Rowling obviously is British, so she wrote this in British English. And
we're translating English into English.
English into English. That's the real world example. So because apparently publishers were concerned about some of the British words not being widely understood in the U.S. Or people being turned off, maybe because people in the U.S. aren't as used to reading translations as maybe people in other countries. They changed things. So they changed the title of the book. The Philosopher's Stone is the British version, and the Sorcerer's Stone is the U.S. version. Or, there were just, little things, like car park in the UK is a parking lot in the US, just like words that people weren't used to. But you can puzzle out the meaning of car park, right? It's like you can kind of grasp from context and from the words what it means. So I always find it's also a chance to get to know the culture of the author, which in a sense is also the culture of the characters, right? So there's two things, and the line is, when does it confuse the reader, right? When does the reader just sit there and be like, I don't understand what's going on anymore? So kind of like that's kind of the part of the translation too, right? You're kind of introducing a different culture, or you're giving the reader an experience, being able, without traveling. And that's one of the cool things that I love about reading too, right? You get to experience all of these things without having to leave your house.
I love it. And I think this is one of the things that I like about, being able to kind of see and understand, my mom who speaks Spanish, lived in Peru, and just traveled in her youth, traveled quite a bit. Like, having experienced or being able to see things through her eyes a little bit broadened my horizon, and so I love I love this concept of translation. Like, how do you communicate? How do you bring meaning between cultures? How do you help people? And even the fact that we have a British Harry Potter and an English or an American Harry Potter, like, indicates that there is a divergence, and even in households, sometimes we speak different languages, and learning to realize when there's a gap. Some of, my most awkward, and I'm not going to go into them here, but my most awkward experiences in France were thinking somebody said one thing when they're actually saying another thing. And so that was fascinating. I have a couple of examples from of that. I have one example of that disconnect. So I was reading the translation copy that I got from Claire, who was my French translator, and there's this line in there where I use the word sour, and she had translated it as bitter or amer in French, which means bitter. But the line itself is about an expression. Somebody had a sour expression, and Claire's pretty good, but every now and then, there would be these things where she kind of ran through the translation. And the actual, what I was trying to say, I was trying to get across this idea that she was irritated or cross, and bitter doesn't work in French. And we talked about it, and she's like, oh yeah, that's supposed to be pincé. So, which means she had kind of a, the character had a pinched look on her face, like, it's a little bit different. Even we say sour. Well, what does that look like on someone? Well, I don't know. What does pinched look like? That's a little bit easier. So even between cultures, we have a different way of expressing ideas. And then, like some of my favorite translation discussions, we talked about how do you translate the upper crust, right? That concept exists in French, but they don't say upper crust. They say le gratin, which is basically a layer of cheese or breadcrumbs that goes on the top of a baked good. So like a quiche or potatoes au gratin, right? It has this bronzed cheese on the top, and that's how they say posh or upper crust. So one of the things that my mom used to talk about was like seeing things in two perspectives, having, being a translator or being multilingual allows you to like maybe bridge gaps a little bit better.
That's very true. And every language has their own, right? So has their own ways of saying things and their own associations that come with them, right? People think one thing or the other, or they're used to one thing or the other, depending on the language.
Yeah, and so that brings us to this question of, like, as an author, how do we facilitate your translation? How do we help you bridge that gap better? Are there things that authors can do? I mean, we're talking about literary translation. We're talking about working with a translator. What can I do as an author to help you be efficient with your time and produce the best possible translation?
Right. That's a good question. And there are a couple things you can do if you want to, right? It always depends on the author, and it always depends on the translator. So there are authors who don't want to communicate with their translators, which is fine. And there are also translators who are like, no, I'm taking this text and I'm making it my own. And that's that. But I really enjoy collaborating with the people I translate because I think it produces a better text, right? And it stays closer that way to what the author intended. And and this is an interesting point too. So in Germany and a few other European countries, I believe France and Italy as well, a translation is a copyrighted text, right? So it is seen as a separate work of art to which I own the copyright. So if I translate your book, I own the copyright to the translation. Because it's a separate text. That's what the law says. So totally lost my train of thought here.
So you're talking about how we can help you as a translator.
Yes. So I do enjoy collaborating and getting as close to the author's vision for the text as possible, right? Because my job as a translator is not to create a new text. My job is it to help other people from my language be able to read your book, right? And to translate your vision for this as closely as I can. So one of the things I appreciate is having access to the author, being able to talk to the author. Okay. And we've done this. So if you're available to the author to talk, you can reach out to the author, to the translator. I guess it depends, right? Does your publisher facilitate this relationship? And you can ask for contact information. The translator may ask for contact information, or if you're self-published, you may, like you did, Ben, you may go find a translator, and then you have an established communication channel anyway.
Yeah, and that was really beneficial with Claire and the French versions. Yeah.
So one of the things, or a couple of things that we have done is I went through the text and I got to ask you questions about it. So what does this mean? Did I understand this joke correctly? It feels like there's something here with the name that you were trying to say, but I'm not quite, sure I understood it the right way. So just being able to ask questions or to have my suspicions confirmed, so to speak, on certain things, that is helpful. If you really want to be, like a star author to a translator, this is especially for fantasy and science fiction authors, right? If there's a lot of things, a lot of concepts, a lot of words that you made up, it always helps to maybe have a list of those words or maybe have a brief explanation, right? So here's the magic system that I made up. It's made up of these 5 types of magic. This is what it means. Or in your case, you had different poisons, right?
Yeah.
So be like, how did you come up with the names? Why did you pick these names? That sometimes makes it easier to stay closer to your intention.
Yeah, because there's a word. So this is not a knock on any translator, right? But you have a language that you're strong in. In theory, your strongest language, Heike, is German. You've lived in the States. You're very articulate in English. You've studied journalism at an American school, right? And yet there are occasionally things that have a cultural connotation or a cultural meaning that can be missed. You're essentially talking about having a style sheet, and a lot of authors do this, is they'll, a glossary or a style sheet that tracks what are the expressions that are common in my world, what are the the magic systems, all the things that you described, names. What are the significance of the names of these places? Those kinds of things. But yeah, that's kind of interesting. I would always tell people it's ideal to get a translator who is translating into their native tongue, because you're gonna get better. Generally, you're gonna get a better quality. I have translated from English to French, but I wouldn't call it literary. I would call it functional.
Right. And that's, again, intention, right? It's like, what are you trying to do? Are you producing a work of art? Are you just producing a readable or understandable translation? Depending on what you're translating. So I used to translate IT manuals for a living. There's no literary anything in those, right? It's just function. So, as long as the person who reads it understands, what buttons to push, we're good.
There's a reason why IKEA doesn't put words in there.
Well, and that's even easier, right? The pictures. But so it's always a matter of intention, right? And who your audience, again, who you're trying to reach. But yes, you're right. Yes, everything you said. So one of the things we did, though, which I found very helpful, was we had a list. Well, we have a shared drive to put the documents in.
All right, so hang on, let me recap.
The translation.
There's access to the author, maybe a style sheet. Even if you don't have access to the author, a style sheet. Okay, and then now you're talking about like a shared. Go ahead. Sorry.
Right. So, style sheet, or like you said, if you have a glossary anyway, or a list of your names or something. I mean, don't put all that much extra work in it. Access is most important, but if you do have any information, that would be helpful. So one of the things that helped me with your translations was that we had a list of all the names and places, or I made up a list of all the names and places. In English, I chose my German translation, and you had already had the French translation.
So I just put the French
So you put in the French names, and that kind of gave me a point of reference to, so now I have 2 points of reference. I have the original in English and I have the French translation, right? Which may just spark, an idea in my head, especially for things that are a bit more involved or a bit more difficult.
Yeah, we struggled with some of the names.
And that's one of the things, right? Names, it's really helpful to know if there's anything behind the name, especially like you said, right? English is not my first language. It's my second language. German's my first language. So there might be things that I miss, right? Like slight things, even though my English is very good, but there might be things that I'm not seeing in that name.
Right.
And, sometimes that's okay. Sometimes that's not important. But if it's important to you as the author to get this point across, then just let me know as the translator.
One of the things that's important to me that I appreciate actually about your approach is the fact that you're considering the other, like, not every translator is going to be able to do what you do, right? You've got an English, you've got a French, you've got a German. If I had Spanish, like, there's this process of, you look at the broad picture, and then you winnow down to what is the core concept here, and you can do that if you have, okay, I know I speak Spanish. So here's the Spanish word, and here's the English word and its connotation. Here's the German word, or the French word. Here's how could I do that to meet German culture, to meet, kind of the, the intent of what's going on here. One of the fun ones. So in Rings, the main character Teacup talks about his cobbler shop that his wife used to run before she died. And I thought it was cute and fun. Oh, we'll call it Happy Souls because they're newlyweds, in a medieval town, and so they have a cobbler shop called Happy Souls. That doesn't really translate to French, right? Because you don't get that concept of a couple, you don't get that concept of shoes, you don't get that concept of happiness. And
doesn't work in German either. That's one of the ones I spend a lot of time on too.
Yeah, and I haven't seen the German solution yet, but the French solution was pas à pas, which means step by step, which it's kind of got this forward motion. Hey, we're taking one day at a time. We're together, but it also step by step has kind of this walking or this shoe centric connotation that I was looking for, and so that for me, with the story, I really kind of liked her bring the story to the reader approach for the French audience, right? I don't need to force them into kind of, I mean, it's medieval, right? It's fantasy. It's almost, prehistory for them. I don't need to bring them into like my way of thinking, especially not for this. And I liked how she, time after time, would say, okay, that's not how a French person would say it. And I wanted the French reader to pick it up and read it like it was a French book, not like I'm going to America and I'm reading a book by an American. Not every translator works that way, but that's one of the things that I appreciate about you and about Claire.
But that's one of the other things, right? So my goal as a translator is to have somebody pick up the book and never, throughout reading that book at all, think about a translator or that this is a translation, right? My goal is for that person to pick up the book and read the story, right? Mm-hmm. And not to be kind of, pulled out of the story because something sounds weird, or, think about, oh, well, this is kind of, weird because of that other thing. But just it's so a translation's good if it doesn't read like a translation, essentially, right? Which is a hard thing to do, but that's kind of what I would aspire to as a translator. Just tell a good story, the way a German person would appreciate it.
Yeah. I want to read a paragraph that I got from Claire, when we were doing the French translations, and talk about it a little bit. So she said, "Hi, Ben, I'm making progress and expect to deliver by the end of the week. I am struggling with some of the specialist vocabulary for like darts and gambling, but I've decided to carry on with the rest of the translation and carry out further research to tidy up loose ends during proofreading. I'll be in touch again in a couple of days with suggestions for a title. Best, Claire." And so I talked about this a little bit earlier about going to France and realizing, oh my gosh, specialist language. I speak French, and now I don't speak French, like having this disconnect. So talk to me a little bit about your approach. Did you do the same thing as Claire? Did you just go through, okay, I'm going to do everything I can do, and I'm going to go back and deal with the specialist language, or how did you do that?
Yes, that's usually one of the things. So I'll do like a run through. Well, I'll read through it first and kind of identify the things that I know I'm going to have to spend more time on, like names or teacup being an acquisitioner in your case, which the German word that translates is a modern word, which, makes you think of maybe an insurance company or, something like that. So that's not at all what I wanted in there.
Yeah, I know.
So you kind of identify the things. But one of the things I imagine Claire had the same struggle with as me was the darts games, right? So you described the darts games, and I know nothing. Like, German being my first language, if this had been in German, I would have been lost too. So I don't know how many hours then you go research, right? You do research. So identify the stuff. Either I ask you to clarify or to explain the game to me. But for some of the things, for some of the words, I'm just going to have to go look at the internet and ask Wikipedia how a game of darts is described in German, because I don't know.
Well, and so that was actually something that was hard for me too, because Claire's, she's translating to French, but she's like, the word, darts, we played different darts games. And she's like, I only played in Britain, right? And so the words in the games and the terms that she was using are a little bit, this is that whole English translated into English again. It keeps coming back, like every day we're translating, when we talk to somebody, what is it that they really mean? And it was funny to me because I wrote this story. I was at I think I've told you this. I was at a NASA shuttle program budget meeting in Huntsville, Alabama. And the whole team went out to eat the night after one of our big program reviews. And so I was supposed to be working on another novel. I show up, and the director of PP&C at the time was this guy who just really good at darts. I guess he plays in a league here in Houston, and or played. I don't know where he's at now. And he was like, I showed up late because I was working on a book, and he was like, hey, do you want to play a game of darts? And I was like, I know nothing about darts. So here now I'm having to I've wrote this story where I have a very limited experience with darts, and now I'm trying to explain. But to finish the story about Dennis, like, so he basically killed me. And I'm pretty good at a lot of stuff. Like, for the credits, I'll bring out the clubs and I'll do some juggling or whatever, But like he killed me. Like I had twice as many darts, and he's still just like, we played cricket, which there's a game of cricket, and I think we may have played loops, but he killed me in both games. Like it was, and I had such a good time playing darts that I went home, and instead of working on this novel that I worked on for 10 years, I wrote a short story. But then Claire's asking me, well, what is this? What is this? I'm like, I know only what Dennis told me. So.
And that's one of the challenges, I guess, as a translator. You're going to come across text where you don't know the subject matter, right? And you're going to have to go out and do research. And you can do research to a certain point, and then some of it is faith as well. You do the best you can.
Yeah.
And, you have your test readers who say they understand what's going on, or they don't, so one of the things in translation is you really get into a text, right? So I will have read every single word of Ben's novel several times by the time I'm done with the translation. So I read this a lot more in depth than any reader ever would, right? And that's why sometimes you can get away with it. Just, I'm not sure that's right. But like, you know, some of the things maybe don't have to be like 150% if they don't make a difference to the story, right? So that's sorry, no, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So the other point I was going to make is time, right? Time constraints. So if you get assigned a translation, you maybe have a deadline, and there's a finite amount of time that you can invest in research, right? Yep. Like if I translate your book and we have a 3-month deadline or something, or there's a budget, I can't go off and research darts games for 2 months, you know, or immerse myself in a darts league, you know, in my hometown or whatever, which I may want to do. So that's one of the things that that is a serious constraint for some translations. So anything that you can give the translator that will free up his or her time a little bit more, because they don't have to go look for certain things.
Well, and that's like, you know, that's helpful. As an author, you know, if you're writing, whatever you're writing, often you'll do a little bit of research, right? If you had to do research, that translator is probably going to have to do research too, because you're like in a specialist. It's like a specialist role. It's like when I'm going to France talking to, you know, people about aerospace stuff, right? Like that's specialist language, and so if I have to call Canada, which is actually what I did, and I asked them for you know, aeronautics terms side by side, because they have to have French and English. That was a godsend, honestly, because you can go on Google and you can look up airplane and you can get the wrong word. You know, you can use aeronautical terms on Google Translate and you will get the wrong word. Another thing that you can do as an author, I think, that I've had to learn working with translators is to manage expectations, right? Sometimes the joke that has to be told is a different joke than you told in your language.
Yes.
Sometimes the innuendo or the nuance, if you want depth, you can have depth, but you can't have depth and have a complete word-for-word machine translation. And that was something that I learned early on working with Claire, and appreciated about her, because she was willing to put in a little bit of extra time and say, okay, we want depth here. The English depth doesn't work. Here are a couple of options. Do you have one that you like better? You know, and we're not going to do that on every page, but for things that seem important, like the name of the character or the place that they live in, or something that has a significance that won't be seen until book 5.
Yes, and that's one of the hardest things, right? Like sometimes there just is no good translation that does all the things you want it to do, no matter how much you research and no matter how much you want it or how hard you try. There's just, something's lost in translation, essentially. But then also some things are added in translation, right? Yep. So like the asterisks and obliques you mentioned, the writers, that is some of the most iconic comic books and jokes also, right, in Germany as well. When I read all of them growing up as a kid, but
yeah,
they're nothing like the French, right? I mean, the general story is the same, but they kind of were like, well, we can't do the translation justice anyway, so we'll make up our own jokes, and they totally work in the German context of this. Just if you ever pick up a French copy and, put it next to the German, you'll know they're both funny and it's both the same kind of humor. It's just not the same jokes. Is there anything, I was wondering, because you have worked with 2 translators so far, is there anything that you have found that was helpful or that made you more comfortable with the process of having your work translated in working with?
Well, to be tongue in cheek, I have a bunch of older siblings. And so I've had to learn to be flexible. To be specific, I have 5 older sisters and 1 older brother. So I got a fair bit of correction as a kid. But I think like, to a point, you have to stick to your guns and say, this is my art. This is where I am. This is where I want to go with it. But understand that your translator is the professional for that language. And, assuming that your publisher, you hired them and went through due process, right? They stand to improve, your work for their culture or their language. And so just trying to have an open mind and a collaborative thought process, because, different cultures have different approaches to things. And if you try and take the American approach, you'll have a product, but you won't get the best possible product. And so, like, as with many things, trying to have an open mind. Do your research beforehand, and then have a little bit of trust. That helped me. It may not help everyone.
Mm-hmm. I think that's good advice. And like talking always helps, right? If you're, and the same as the author, right? If you're not sure, just ask, and the translator will more often than not be more than happy, like I always am, to talk about their translations or their choices or their decision-making process, right? Or any of those things. So communication always helps.
So my context is probably a little different than some, right? I was reading the French translation, and there were things that I was like, is that right? And 95 to 98% of the time, I was wrong. Mm-hmm. But there were a couple where Claire was like, oh yeah, and I could have just sat on that and stewed on that and been like, she had all these errors. But the fact of like going and talking to her and being like, hey, let's talk about this, this, and this. And she's like, oh, no, this is how it is in French, silly Ben. And then she didn't really say it like that. She was,
I hope not.
I'm very good. But in 1 or 2 cases, she was like, oh yeah, I must have done that really fast. And this may have been before she had her editor go through. But again, the editor isn't always a translator, right? So they didn't see the original English text. Yeah. And so the other thing that I did, so I translate English into English. That's the joke, right? I work for NASA, and I do some work with contracts where we issue a statement of work. So it describes what work are we trying to actually accomplish. And so I was able to down select. I ran a procurement basically for my translator, and I have friends who speak French, and so I took those samples that I acquired of their work. And again, you got to compensate. If you can't ask somebody to do a sample for free. But I took the samples of the work that they did, and I read them, and I had a friend read them, and I had selection criteria, and we came up with him and his family came up with the same answer. Mm-hmm. And so when I went with Claire, I was already very comfortable that she had the chops to do it the way it needed to be done.
Well, you spoke that language, but we do have, for those of you who are wondering, do I want to translate? Do I want to spend the money to translate? How much are we talking? What are the languages that I can translate into? How do I find a translator? How do I vet a translator? How do I go about all this? We've put together a couple of resources that are going to be available for you guys on Ben's website, which is, correct me if I'm wrong, BK Hewitt, HEWETT.com. Yes? Yep.
BK Hewitt, HEWETT.com.
So they're going to be available there for you. A couple of websites that do this better than we ever could. Step-by-step processes. A couple of authors that have had the works translated and their experiences with this to help you get started, or just, read more about it if you're interested in the topic.
All right.
So thank you guys for joining us. I guess this was fun for us. I hope it was fun for you as well. You learned a couple of things.
I did. And thanks, Heike, for asking me to help out.
Oh, this was fun to do together. Absolutely.
All right, guys. Well, we'll put it in the credits. Never mind.
Okay.